Welcome to another episode of the Capital H podcast. Today, we're tackling a topic that's top of mind for organizations everywhere: compensation. At a moment when AI, transparency, and trust are colliding, I'm glad to be joined by Ruth Thomas, Chief Compensation Strategist at Payscale. We'll dig into these trends and discuss highlights from Payscale's new 2026 Compensation Best Practices report. Ruth, thank you for joining us on Capital H.
Thank you for having me.
So Ruth, let's dig in. And obviously, many organizations are experimenting with AI and compensation in a variety of different ways. And in Payscale's report, you noted that AI can be a force multiplier. So can you share what that looks like in compensation workflows today?
Well, I think compensation has been ripe for AI enablement. It's a process that has lots of manual processes and lots of data to be able to be processed as well. If I think about job description management is the other area where we've seen like the highest AI adoption so far, I really think compensation and a lot of the administration work that goes around that is really ripe for that. So that's where I think I see the force multiplier coming in. It's the speed and scale at which we can probably do a lot of those burdensome tasks that we've been used to doing in compensation, and allowing us more time to think about strategically the outputs of what we're seeing and having more of an impact on the organization.
Yeah, I think job descriptions are one of the biggest examples I hear from organizations right at that intersection of the total rewards teams and the recruitment teams, right? With that interaction with the business. And people in the past who have said, why does it take me so long to get a job description done to go out and hire? And the ability to accelerate that has a material impact on the business, right? Less time spent on what is in the job description, more time spent on hiring the individual to get them in place. So Ruth, from your research, where did you all see AI having the potential in certain types of compensation work, like market analysis, scenario modeling, right? If I do this much base versus bonus versus other, and where does human judgment still need to lead?
Well, in the Compensation Best Practice Report, which is our annual piece of research that we published in February, so we surveyed 3,500 practitioners this year, and we surveyed them on a broad cross-section of best practices and how they think compensation trends are going to play out in 2026. We did a big section on AI this year, not surprisingly, and one of the things we asked them is what did they see AI helping to improve compensation decisions. And we saw that speed and efficiency came out as the highest. 40% of the respondents said that was one of the key benefits they saw of AI. The second most cited benefit was reduced administration burden on HR and managers. So that was like 32%. And then the ability to analyze large data sets, that came in as like the third best use case where people could see AI benefiting compensation.
Well, the speed and efficiency one, I think, really resonates with what I'm seeing and hearing from a number of organizations, and inclusive just at the most macro level, right? Not just only in compensation, but how can I use AI to drive speed and efficiency broadly? What I think many organizations are also grappling with is how to make sure that speed doesn't come at the trade-off of other costs, right? And in your report, one of the biggest risks that leaders cited was potentially the over-reliance on AI, and that maybe reducing actual human context or human judgment. So how are you seeing organizations begin to design compensation workflows so that AI can help accelerate decisions, but it doesn't replace the human accountability?
There's a lot of concern around like how do we keep the human in the loop in compensation decisions? And I think people have always have concern about the efficacy of compensation decisions. There's a lot of legal and, as I said, ethical implications of the decisions you make around pay and what you're rewarding someone in an organization. So naturally, I understand where the concern comes in. And I think although we think about AI supporting compensation decisions, being able to scan these large, multiple different data sets and come like with the best answer for us, one of the things we still have today is not all those data points are naturally captured. So all the data points that go into making a decision about a person, we are not always there. So you might know that you've got two people doing the same job who have the same tenure in the role, who potentially have the same skills, but what you don't know is that potentially one of them was hired at a time when it was a particularly hot market, and that's why their pay is higher than the other. So at this moment, not all those data points are captured, and that's where we kind of still need the compensation professional, the HR practitioner in the loop to be able to kind of work with the managers to say, okay, why are we paying this person what we're paying? And until we get all those data points captured, I think we still need that human in the loop.
What you said there around the context is so key. I think every number of organizations start in simple places, oftentimes with AI saying, oh, I've got some tool that's going to listen in on my meetings, right? It's going to take notes, but the AI note taker does not necessarily bring the context from meeting to meeting to meeting, right? So the human brings that contextual understanding of what is happening in that broader business environment. And I know here we are in early 2026. There have been some wild swings in the market over the last several years relative to compensation, right? 2021, people were moving between organizations for double digit, 20%, 30% or more oftentimes. Now people are talking about, are we job hugging, low fire, low hire environment? So it's a very different compensation environment within a short amount of time. So I think that's a pretty critical piece of, to your point, what the humans, the rewards professionals are bringing to the table. So Ruth, one of the things combining the conversation topics around how AI can help drive decisions and where human context and judgment is needed is thinking about what does that look like from a governance perspective, right? So what sort of kind of governance controls do you see as being non-negotiable when AI is being brought into the compensation process at organizations?
This is really topical because we're pushing more AI through our product portfolio and through our data portfolio. And these are the questions that our customers are asking is like, how can we trust the decisions that are being made by the AI in your solutions? I think transparency is key. So transparency over where the data is coming from that's driving those decisions, and also transparency around the methodology. So we often get asked about what is the methodology in our data source, and then what is the methodology in how we job matched a particular role, for example. So we are having to document all that. We're having to share that with our customers as they make decisions about whether they're going to use the AI in our tools. And then also importantly, I think along the way, providing confidence signals. So that's one of the things we'll do, for example, in our job matching process. When you've deployed the AI to help speed up the whole job matching process, we give a confidence signal. And then you, as the human in the loop, can decide, okay, well, am I going to take that match or am I going to ask it to go back round again? And then you can also kind of set your own confidence levels as well of where you feel comfortable. So transparency is really key. Another thing I'd probably say is being clear where the human handoffs happen. So that human accountability. So, okay, the AI has made the decision. At what point are you handing it over to the human to make that decision? I think that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
An important word that I think you used there was transparency, right? Because workers are going to want to know if AI is being used in something that has implications for my pay, who is accountable for making sure that it works right, right? Too many people in the last few years have learned about things like hallucinations, and no one wants AI hallucinating with your compensation data unless for somehow it turns into you magically winning the lottery at your company. But then you probably don't want to deal with your company trying to claw that back. So one of the other things that I think organizations are often trying to grapple with is because of the pressure to make decisions faster, how do you as an organization actually make sure that managers, leaders aren't just trusting the AI out the gate, right? Where is it trust but verify or understanding the context around the information coming? So where do you see some of those other practical safeguards to help organizations maintain that human oversight and not have managers maybe default in the trap of trusting the AI outputs too quickly?
I think this is one of those clear examples of where we think about AI coming into a process and improving it, but we don't always think about changing the process. And I think this is one of those clear examples, because I think we need to start thinking about monitoring the decisions that are being made by the managers on the AI data. So, I mean, it's really good old calibration, really. We calibrate pay decisions, we calibrate performance decisions, but we should probably, as we see people making decisions supported by AI, we should also monitor those decisions and not just say, oh, they must be right because they've been done by AI. So I think calibrating across reviewers, pulling a random sample and understanding kind of how AI was part of that decision-making process and making sure that you're kind of moderating that for consistency and auditing approval patterns where the AI and the humans have been working together.
Absolutely. Now, Ruth, we've talked about governance and accountability here from, I would say, within the organization, managers, rewards professionals. What role do you see, at least for public companies, the board of directors having to play in that, right? Because public company boards have a compensation committee. So what role do you see in the board also playing a role from a governance perspective in the usage of AI in the compensation realm?
I probably the same as they have been considering how AI is generally deployed across the business. I think you mentioned earlier around we've seen a focus on laws around how AI is used in talent acquisition. I think we are going to see the same thing in compensation. It's a natural area where we'll probably see like laws focusing because, as I said, of the efficacy and the kind of legal concerns around fair pay decisions and the impact that can have. So I think that is going to become a board focus is like, okay, that's the next thing we're going to have to deal with in terms of thinking about governance over where AI is used within the organization.
Let's even use that to acknowledge the regulatory environment for the compensation domain has been one that's been changing in the last few years, especially with many of the pay transparency requirements within a few states, within the US, within the entirety of the EU, which has really been a stress test moment for organizations' compensation strategy, right? There are examples of organizations having jobs posted with incredibly wide bands, right? Or how some of that plays itself out. And so while organizations have often acknowledged like they want to be more transparent, there's been a variety of things that have caused maybe the organizations lagging behind that intent. So where are you seeing companies maybe struggle the most when they're trying to operationalize pay transparency and being compliant with some of these new regulatory requirements?
Well, interestingly, one thing I hear more often than not from our customers who are wanting to obviously like implement pay transparency, executive buy-in. So there's a general concern about, do we want to tell everybody what we're paying within the organization? And I think that's also driven by a fear over cost. I mean, I've been working with organizations for a number of years, helping them with pay equity analysis. And that's often one of the first kind of hurdles that I hear people or concerns that people have is like, how much is it going to cost me to fix pay equity in this organization? When you actually look at the data, and if you look across organizations that have done this, 1% of payroll is kind of like quite generous in terms of how much it costs to fix pay equity. So that's one of the conversations we often have with an organization when they say, we're scared of implementing pay transparency. We think it's going to cost us too much. And so we kind of cover that base first, but then we quickly pivot to like the benefits that you're going to get from this, because there's a much more benefits other than thinking about just compliance. It's the trust that you can gain in an organization from deploying pay transparency.
Yeah, I think to your point, many organizations probably don't realize, and they're probably thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to go comply with these things, and I'm going to spend all this extra money making sure that we're paying equitably across roles and geographies and you name it. But if 1% of payroll and it is paying back potentially in orders of magnitude for what does that say to the workers, right? That has a tension around the way you're setting the tone from a culture perspective as a place that workers might say, I want to be here because my organization is taking the right steps on this. I now have an understanding of when I think there's a pay equity situation, how to navigate it, what my organization is going to do to take care of it. Like that may pay off in spades from a cultural perspective. And that, I think to your point, risk benefit ratio, often maybe organizations are paying too much on to the risk side of things.
Yeah, very much focused on the compliance side. I mean, I always think it's interesting if you think back to who were the first adopters of pay transparency, and this was pre any of the state-based legislation that we have in the US. And the reason they adopted pay transparency was because transparency was an organizational value. And they felt that if that's something they wanted to bring to life in their organization, they needed to do it about pay as well. So I always think about those case studies when I talk to organizations about how important it is to understand that trust equation. I always talk about the fair pay equation. If your employees feel they're paid fairly, then they're more inclined to be engaged in the workforce, and therefore they're going to hopefully be more productive in the workforce, and they're going to help you achieve those business outcomes. And I think that's really important for executives to understand that key link.
Absolutely. Now, another aspect of pay transparency that I think workers really care about is not just pay ranges, but it's who's making the decisions and how are they making it? Where have you seen organizations really do a good job of explaining the pay decision-making process versus just disclosing, here's the people that were in the room?
Well, I think it's the organizations that start from the top. You really have to understand what your compensation philosophy is. Otherwise, it's very hard to explain pay. I mean, your compensation philosophy should be your guide to how you're differentiating pay within the organization and how individuals can progress their pay in the organization. If you don't understand what those factors are, so maybe you're paying for performance, you're paying for job level, you're paying by geo, whatever it is within your organization, skills, certifications, you have to be clear about that because that's your starting point and they all kind of disseminates from there. That allows you to build structures and the processes in place that work around those key principles. And then it makes it a lot easier to have conversations with people about where they should sit in a pay range, when they're being hired into the organization, why they're being hired in at the level, the pay offer that you're giving them.
Now, Ruth, I think that and the way in which you tied it earlier to organizational values around transparency and trust becomes such a big takeaway for organizations to actually revisit what are our stated values to employees and how are we living that when it comes to the topic of compensation, not just, again, pay ranges, but things like explaining how the decisions are made, the components of the decision process, et cetera. One thing, the report that you all shared, you noted that setting aside some of the regulatory drivers of this, many organizations were targeting a broader transparency than maybe the base requirement over the next few years. So what are you seeing really separates companies that are building trust through that additional transparency above and beyond what's regulatory required versus where organizations might unintentionally be creating confusion?
So one of the trends that we've noted over probably the last 3 to 4 years in our research is the broader adoption of pay transparency outside of where they're legally required to do. So one of the things we ask organizations is, do you post pay ranges in states where you're not required to do? And we've seen that grow. So now more organizations post ranges whether they're required to by law or not. And that for me is showing that they're thinking about this thing of creating a consistent employee experience. We saw it before when salary history bands were introduced in the US. We saw global companies kind of spreading that practice globally. And we are starting now to see that trend happening much more across the US in terms of organizations sharing pay ranges so that all employees, wherever you are in the country, or whichever part of the organization you work for, you all have the same experience.
So, Ruth, we've covered a good amount of kind of some of the insights from this compensation best practices report. But one of the topics that I think organizations have really been grappling with over the last few years as well has been remote work, some return to office, hybrid, and the implications of what that has from a compensation perspective. And I know there's another survey with some interesting findings that folks, I would encourage you to go read as well. But can you share just some highlights for how have you seen compensation evolving tied to the topic of remote work over the last few years?
Yeah, so the whole remote work RTO situation has been one of the other key influences on people's compensation practices and on their strategies. It's been interesting to observe. We haven't really seen one key practice emerge. So there are normally like 3 options for people. One is that they decide to pay everybody the same. So we kind of went towards national medians and we pay everybody the same irrespective of where they work. Then we had kind of simplification where we've seen a lot of organizations paying people in zones like high pay zones, medium pay zones, low pay zones. And then we've seen people being very specific about paying people in the geo in which they're located. And through some of the research that we've seen, it's been fairly evenly split. And again, that comes back to what we've been talking about here is organizational values. So if you're as an organization saying that you're going to respect the work that people bring to the organization and you're not going to take into consideration where they're located, then that's why you might choose to go like, we're just going to pay everybody the same wherever they're based. So it's been interesting to observe those different practices.
Which I think becomes actually the way you framed that there. This has never been a conversation about remote work. Are you in office or pay specifically tied to that? This is what is your business strategy at large? What's the workforce and the talent needs that you have to deliver on said business strategy? What's the culture and environment that you want people working within? And how do things like your compensation practices enable all of that, right? And yes, external market factors come into play, like the 2021 hiring market and where things are now. But those are almost responses to things. And there are still big organizational statements that you can make. So, Ruth, for our listeners, whether they're a compensation professional or not, What's one or two things that you would just leave them with as they think about where compensation trends might be headed and how they should be thinking about navigating those trends in terms of leading their teams, their own roles and careers, just things to keep in mind?
Well, I think pay transparency is going to continue to be a key theme, and that's not just going to be driven by legislation, because at the same time, we've had this evolving patchwork of legislation, we've had rising employee expectations, and that's not going to go away. You can't change that now. So we talked about it a bit earlier. You were talking about, will employees' expectations now extend to how AI is influencing their pay? I think that the employee expectations is just going to continue to rise. So if you haven't started your pay transparency journey, you're really going to need to start that. And one of the key things we've seen is the need to advance your compensation maturity in order to do that, because you can't be transparent if you're not paying people fairly across the organization, if you don't have the structures in place to be able to make sure that is happening on a day-to-day basis. So another thing we have observed through our research is the advancements of compensation maturity overall for organizations. If you're at a starting point as an organization, really just like, where am I? Where do I need to go? What do I want to achieve out of this? And as we've talked consistently through this episode today, is thinking about how that translates to what you're trying to achieve from an organizational perspective.
Awesome. So, Ruth, I just want to thank you for joining Capital H. Folks, if there were a couple of things that I think you should take away from this conversation, first of all, there is the tremendous potential benefit and impact for rewards professionals and for leaders out in the business for how AI and automation capabilities can be a force multiplier, right, to driving decisions, especially in response to regulatory things like pay transparency that can be for the benefit of the organization. But if you're not pairing that with clarity around where is human judgment remaining, human accountability, making sure that you have certain governance controls in place, you actually risk introducing confusion or lack of trust. And so you need to pair those investments with the technology, with the investments in the very human things that will build trust with your workers, with your leaders, with your managers, with your candidates, right, who are looking at entering your organizations. And so I would definitely encourage you, read the compensation best practices report. Also read the remote work survey for some additional findings if you'd like to go deep into that. Thank you all for listening to the Capital H podcast. Ruth, thank you again for joining.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.